Today I am going to discuss about the different numbers on the sandpapers. So keep watching the video and I will tell you exactly when to use what number of sandpaper.
Hello everyone and welcome to Ryson Spray Booth. And today I am going to show you the most used sandpapers which I use most of the time while doing my paint jobs. So let's get started.
So here I am just going to tell you in advance that each Autobody and painter have a slightly different perspective when it comes to sandpaper grid. But today I am going to share with you the sandpaper grids which I use while doing my Autobody and paint works and which give me amazing results. So let's get started. So I will start with the 80 grit sandpaper, and this is a Starkey brand sandpaper, and as you can see the texture of this sandpaper is so rough. So this is one of the roughest sandpaper. You still get more coarse sandpapers than this, but 80 grit sandpaper is the sandpaper which I use most of the time on all my paint jobs. So this 80 grit sandpaper should be used before applying putty to make grooves in the dented area, or if you want to remove the rust from your metal surface, then 80 grit sandpaper is the best choice because it can remove rust very easily. Also, if you want to remove the entire paint from a surface and reach the bare metal, then 80 grit best sandpaper is the best choice for that. So basically you will have to use the sandpapers 6 times while doing any paint job. One is before applying putty, then after applying putty, then before applying primer, after applying primer, before applying base coat, and after applying the clear coat, which is an optional one. So these are the 6 times that you will have to use your sandpapers. So I will move on now to my next sandpaper, and the next sandpaper is a 180 grit sandpaper. So once you sand with 80 grit sandpaper and apply your putty, you will have to use the 80 grit sandpaper once again to level the surface up, because 80 grit sandpaper leaves deep scratches in the putty. So to get rid of those deep scratches, you will have to use either 150 or a 180 grit sandpaper to get a smooth surface. So here I will compare both the sandpapers and I will show you. As you can see, the 80 grit sandpaper is so much coarse and the 180 grit sandpaper is a lot smoother than the 80 grit sandpaper. Even from far you can make out the difference between the two. Now the question is, when do I use this 180 grit sandpaper? So once I sand down the putty and even out the surface with the 80 grit sandpaper, then I sand my surface with a 150 grit sandpaper to remove the deep scratches which the 80 grit sandpaper have made. And then after I sand with the 150 grit sandpaper, I will sand with the 180 grit sandpaper on top of it to level out all the scratches which the 150 grit sandpaper has made. I don't have the 150 grit sandpaper to show you at the moment, but it is a little bit coarser than the 180 grit sandpaper. Then the next which I have is a 220 grit sandpaper, and this 220 grit sandpaper I use before applying the primer. So once you are done leveling the putty with 80 grit sandpaper, you use the 150 grit sandpaper, then you use the 180 grit sandpaper, and then before applying primer you use 220 grit sandpaper, which will totally smooth out the area. Once you sand with the 220 grit sandpaper, you are ready to apply the primer. So wherever you want to apply the primer, use a 220 or 240 grit sandpaper to sand the surface before applying the primer. So I will compare all 3 sandpapers and I will show you. The 80 grit sandpaper is coarse, then the 180 is slightly smoother, and the 220 is a lot smoother. So once you sand the surface down with the 220 grit sandpaper, you apply the primer. So now the primer is dry, and now comes our next sandpaper, that is the 320 grit sandpaper. This is the sandpaper which you will have to use before painting your base coat or a single stage enamel paint. So this 320 grit sandpaper is used to smoothen the primer. When you spray the primer is not very evenly laid. You'll have to sand it down with the 320 grit sandpaper and it will become nice and smooth. So this 320 grit sandpaper is smoother than the 220 grit sandpaper. You will not see much difference on the camera here between the 220 and the 320. So as you can see here, this is the 80 grit, then comes the 180 grit, then comes the 220 grit, and then the last one is the 320 grit. So as you can see the difference between all 4 of them. So the next sandpaper which comes is the 400 grit sandpaper. This is the alternative to the 320 grit sandpaper. Sometimes if you don't get a 320 grit sandpaper, then you can use the 400 grit sandpaper to smoothen the primer before applying the base coat or single stage enamel paint. They both serve the same purpose, but the 400 grit sandpaper is slightly more smoother than the 320 grit sandpaper. So I will compare all the sandpapers again. So this is the 80, 180, 220, 320, 400. You can even sand with 400 grit sandpaper on top of the 320 grit sandpaper to make the surface even more smoother. So if you keep the 320 and 400 grit sandpaper side to side, you will not see much of a difference. Only you might hear the difference in the sound. So let's check the sound of the 320 and of the 400. So there is very little difference between both the sandpapers. So the next sandpaper which I will be talking about is the 1500 grit sandpaper, and this is the sandpaper which I use while doing buffing of my clear coat. So this 1500 grit sandpaper is used mostly to make the clear coat flat. So I will just compare the 400 grit sandpaper and the 1500 grit sandpaper. You can just hear the sound of the scraping. This is a very smooth sandpaper which is used to level your clear coat. That's why it is so smooth, so that you will not cut through the clear coat and reach the paint. And the next sandpaper is the 2000 grit sandpaper, which I use just before I start my buffing. So before doing your buffing, you should use your 2000 grit sandpaper. So what I do is I use the 1500 grit sandpaper first to make the process a little bit faster. And once I'm done sanding with the 1500 grit sandpaper, I use the 2000 grit sandpaper to make it flat and then start my buffing. And these are DS and sanding discs. I will try to make a separate video on the sanding discs, so I will keep it on the side for now. So what I have next is I have one more 2000 grit sandpaper which is of a different brand. As you can see here, this is also a 2000 grit sandpaper. So what I will suggest here is, if you are using one brand of sandpapers, then don't mix them up, because even though they are both same number of grit sandpapers, the roughness of the sandpapers will vary. And as you can see, even though it is a 2000 grit sandpaper, it is slightly rougher than the 3M 2000 grit sandpaper. So that is why don't mix them up. If you are using one brand of sandpaper, just stick to it. Because sometimes what happens is, if you use 2000 grit sandpaper of another brand, which can be as rough as the 1500 grit sandpaper of 3M brand. So if you sand a clear coat with a 2000 grit sandpaper, which is actually rough as a 1500 grit sandpaper of 3M brand, your shine will not show up that easily, because instead of a 2000 grit sandpaper, you have sanded it with a 1500 grit sandpaper, which is actually numbered as a 2000 grit sandpaper. Hoping that you have got what I am trying to tell you. Because sometimes the cheap quality sandpapers, the grit is not accurate. They put the number, but it is a different grit. So always stick to one brand which you trust, which you have used, and with which you have got good results. So one more important thing I want to tell you here is, if you sand a surface with 80 grit sandpaper and then you move on directly to 400 grit sandpaper, and in this process you miss all these sandpapers in between. So what this will do is, once you spray the paint onto your vehicle, all the deep scratches which the 80 grit sandpaper had made will show up on your paint job, making it look awful. Many people do this mistake. They don't use this in between sandpaper, and their scratches, deep scratches, show up on their paint job. So first you'll have to use 80, then 150, then 180, then 220, then 320, and then 400. This is the line that you should be following, and these are the major number of sandpaper grids which you should be using. If you break this line, for sure the deep scratches from the lesser number grid sandpapers will show up on your paint job.
So hoping that you like the video. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share. And if you want more knowledge about autobody and painting, then I have put some more videos on the side. Just check them out and do let me know what type of videos you would like to have. So till then, this is Raisen Fernandez signing out. Until we meet again.